So let's focus a little bit on the growth of the church in the 20th century and kind of the church life. You've talked some, you mentioned before, about women not being members of the church or voting members until a certain point. When the church was first formed, how did it fund itself, basically?
The church was built, funded by selling pews. If I recall, Daniel Abbott, as one might expect, bought some large number, let's say 18 pews. Others bought a significant number. So that paid for the church, and then to meet the annual budget expenses, the pew rent. Pews were rented, and I imagine the way it worked was they drew up a budget every year or looked at the expenses and said, okay, there are X number of pews, divide that into the budget, and that's what the pew rent is this year. And that system continued until 1915, when things were apparently quite chaotic, in that there were only people who owned pews could vote on certain things, and people who rented pews could vote on other things, and it was completely out of hand. So as I understand it, at the annual meeting in 1915, they voted to approve all previous acts, whether they'd been voted on legally or not, and abolished pew rents and pew ownership, and established the what the church history calls the budget system, which I take to mean the every member canvass type of raising money.
You mentioned when women could vote.
Okay.
What was that progression?
Well, a number of women signed the original Articles of Agreement, so they were not totally excluded at any time, but somewhere in the 1840s, 50s, or what have you, the ladies were invited to participate in the annual meeting, and they have ever since.
With voting rights?
With voting rights.
So far before suffrage, basically.
Far before suffrage, and I don't know about the Universalist Church, what their history in that regard was, but I do know that our church, the Unitarian Church, did adopt women's suffrage very early on, as you say.
So you mentioned conversion to the budgeting system, and you've talked about the Stevens, I. Frank and Philip Stevens, and sort of their tenure as treasurers of the congregation. Yeah. Talk a little bit about that history.
Okay. The Stevens family, for 2 generations, were, if there was such a thing as pillars of the church, they were the ones. Isaac Frank Stevens was one of the founders of the Maine Manufacturing Company. Those are the buildings down almost to the Hudson Bridge. And he was, without question, the ice refrigerator king. It was his plant down there was the largest ice refrigerator plant in the world. And they had sale agents from Melbourne, Australia to Liverpool, England.
Amazing.
And Frank Stevens obviously made a great deal of money. Frank Stevens was the treasurer of the church for many years, for 25 years, I believe. And then I think there was somebody else for a period, and then his son, Philip Ellis Stevens, who I knew and kicked in the shins once, was treasurer for another 25 years. So Stevens, his father and son, were between them treasurers of the church for 50 years. And I remember telling that at some meeting, some Unitarian meeting, and somebody looked at me with horror and said, well, I hope the books were audited. And my response to that was, you did not audit the books of Frank or Philip Stevens. But
so I've heard the story that they basically would cover the shortfall in the budget.
They tended to. And I should add that Philip, Frank's children were, they all had either a first initial or a middle name. I. Blaine Stevens, Philip Ellis Stevens, John Bartlett Stevens, Lawrence Nye Stevens, and Elizabeth Stevens. And I, except for Lawrence, I knew all of those people. And they were, every single one of them except for Elizabeth and Lawrence, were at one time or another presidents of the church. As I say, this was the family that was the pillar of the church. And as far as fundraising is concerned, we of course had a fund drive, every member canvass every year. And I think that after the canvass, the Stevens family and Anna Stearns kind of got together and said, well, how did we do? And if we hadn't done as well as we would like to have done, that was their contribution.
Amazing. So let's shift now to kind of the building of the parish house here.
Okay.
And what was the motivation for doing that, and kind of the history, the initial design, and so forth?
Well, obviously in the church there was no space for church school, for church suppers, for anything except church services. And I do not know whether they held their business meetings there, but in my early part of my lifetime, business meetings were not held in the church. They were held in the auditorium upstairs here in the parish house, not dignified to conduct business in the sanctuary. I'm glad we've gotten over that. But there was definitely a need for a parish house, and the subject was discussed as far back as 1914, 1915, and Frank Stevens had his pet architect draw up plans, and there's a picture on the wall over there, which is a watercolor sketch of from the architect showing the parish house as he conceived it to be. However, I think that was 1915, and World War I was on and construction costs were rising.
Right.
And so the church decided that they couldn't afford it at that time. So that got deferred until the late 1920s, when it was decided to use the plans that were already in existence and build this parish house. One change at the very last minute, the front door was to have been pretty much where the stairs are now, going out into the cemetery. And if you look at the drawings that are down in the vault in the White Wing building, the present arrangement with a door between the church and the parish house is a tissue paper overlay sketched on top of the original drawings.
Oh.
So that was an extremely last-minute change. In order to make room for the parish house, it was necessary to move the church. So it got, if you look at the picture up here, you will see that the front steps are pretty much centered on the church, and if you went out and looked now, you would see that they are not.
They're offset.
They're offset by about 20 feet. And so in 1926, I think it was, the church was moved sidewise about 20 feet to make room for the parish house, and a couple of years later, 2 or 3 years later, this building was built. And I've told many people the story about how some years ago some of the church youth group was asking me about church history, and they said, how did the church get moved? And so since I can't resist a good story, I said, well, one Sunday everybody came to church, but instead of having a service, everybody formed all the way around the church, and when the minister said lift, everybody lifted and moved the church 20 feet. And one of the kids looked at me and said, Mr. Sampson, I don't believe that.
Independent thinkers, right?
Smart kid. But it did get moved, and if you go down in the cellar of the church, you can see some of the old foundation walls, and you could get a rather exact measure as to just exactly how much it was moved.
And how was the building funded?
The parish house?
Yes.
we got a mortgage from the American Unitarian Association, and obviously the congregation put up money. And I suspect, but don't know, that Frank Stevens, who died just before this was built, probably put up a lot of money. And the building this was very much his building. He hired the architect, looked at the plan, said, I like it, and so forth. Whether he's the one who changed the entrance, I have no idea. But
And it's a shame he didn't get to see it completed.
he never got not to see it, but all of his children did. And
you said they had a party to burn the mortgage when it was
Yes.
paid off?
when the mortgage got paid off, which would be in like 1948, because I was there, high school student, in the dining room in here, there was Frederick Elliott May, the president of the American Unitarian Association, came up. Phil Stevens was the treasurer at the time. George Melcher was the clerk. Ed Cahill was the minister. And we've got a picture someplace of all three of them gathered around the table, ostensibly burning the mortgage. There's a flaming piece of paper in the dish in front of them.
So it might have been symbolic.
I think it was probably symbolic, yes. So this building is pretty much the way it was built, except for the stairs and the elevator, which we did about 10 years ago. The stairs were very steep because they had been intended to go up over the entrance that I was speaking of. They were very steep, and they had cast iron anti-skid treads on them. And I remember as a child being over here with my mother and being told not to play on the stairs. If I fell, I'd be hurt badly.
Yeah.
And finally, I reached the age where once again I felt the stairs were dangerous, and was very happy when we put in an elevator and made the stairs much more amenable.
Yeah, they were very steep.
They sure were.
So let's fast forward to the 50s and the building of White Wing. What's the story behind that?
Okay. Well, next to the church on that side was the National Guard Armory, which was a very armory fortress type building, stone and brick with gun ports and loopholes and so forth. And there were pictures of it, which I hope we'll be able to include in this presentation. But one Sunday morning in 1957, we came to church, and within a few minutes, we're told by the fire department we had to get out of the church because the armory was burning. And it did indeed burn. The fire department did a fantastic job of putting down a water curtain between the church and the armory so that there wasn't even any paint blistered.
Wow.
But I do remember being in the church, one of the last people out, and you could feel very intense heat coming through those windows. And so we were just incredibly lucky. But it was also a glorious opportunity to acquire some additional land, which has always been, particularly for parking, which has been a problem for us, and more space. It's not quite true that we formed a committee out in the street while the building was burning, but pretty close to it.
People were probably thinking of that.
People were thinking about it, and guess who became the chairman of the building committee? Philip Ellis Stevens. So we bought the old armory. There was some discussion. Some people in the church wanted to retain the old brick and stone walls and build our new building inside of that. And a number of people, and I guess Bliss Woodruff would be the principal one, thought that was a horrible idea. And so that was totally demolished, and Bliss designed the present building. And to me, that's a brand new building.
Right.
But I have to think that it's now approaching 50 years old.
Beautiful building. And at that time, there was no public kindergarten, so it served a real
There had
need.
been a public kindergarten. In fact, I went to public kindergarten, and for many, many years, you had to be my age to have gone to a public kindergarten. They closed in 1937 because the city couldn't afford it.
Interesting.
So when we built the White Wing, okay, we've got this wonderful brand new building with all sorts of facilities for kids, small children. So we started the White Wing with the stated objective of running the best grades pre-grade 1 kindergarten in Nashua. And I think we've pretty much achieved that objective. I would just add about that building, again, this relates to the Stevens family. They were obviously not making ice refrigerators in 1957.
No.
But they had formed a subsidiary called Grade Aid Corporation that made school furniture, and all of the metal cabinets in there, Grade Aid Corporation, main manufacturing company products. And I know that they were supplied at no or at cost or nearly pretty cheap.
Right. Amazing.
Well, bad word, cheap. They were a great gift.
Right. A gift from them. So over the course of the years, reflect some on how the theology and the political leanings of the church have changed.
Well, there was no question that the early Unitarian Church in Nashua, First Unitarian Congregational Society in Dunstable, now Nashua, was a Christian Unitarian church. And I think it remained basically Christian-oriented, at least until the time of Otto Leiding, who became the minister in 1922, 23, and probably was essentially Christian. We certainly, in those days, there were 2 readings every morning, lessons as they were called, one of them almost invariably from the Bible. We recited the Lord's Prayer, and I think that the majority of people would have considered themselves Christians, but Unitarian Christians. I knew Otto Leiding fairly well in his later years and my younger years, and I strongly suspect that he was not as orthodox a Christian as much of his congregation, but I can't prove that. When he retired, Ernest Sommerfeld became the minister. He was only here 2 years, and so I don't think he had much influence. But his successor was Ed Cahill, who was very definitely much more in the humanist tradition. Ed Cahill was very willing to accommodate the people who wanted a Christian orientation, but his personal philosophy and his political philosophy was very much on the liberal side. I should add that the church in my childhood had 1 Democrat in it, as nearly as I can tell. And I remember, I did not hear this, but my parents remarked on it after a Sunday service in November 1940, when Franklin Roosevelt had been elected for a 3rd term, and the minister, Mr. Leiding, began his morning prayer with, "Oh Lord, in view of the disappointments of the past week." And I remember Phil Stevens once at a Layman's Sunday thing talking about his father, I. Frank, saying that my father always said he thanked God he was born an American, he thanked God he was born a Unitarian, and he thanked God he was born a Republican.
So quite a change over the years. And then Don Rowley sort of brought in a real strong...
Don Rowley arrived and definitely brought in a humanist, agnostic message. And of course, Don told us time after time, don't confuse Rowleyism with Unitarianism. But the change, probably, I think Cahill started the change. Leon Fay, somewhere in between, and then Don made heathens of all of us.
So I've heard from a variety of people how this was really a social gathering place for many years.
I mean, the parish house here?
Yes, and the church, but the parish house in particular.
Well, when I was in high school, the RE director, American Unitarian Youth Advisor, was a man named Elmer Stelly, who was a very talented youth group leader. And under Elmer's stimulus, we ran dances and square dances and so forth in the auditorium up here. That was so popular that there was standing room only. In other words, the fire marshal had said how many people you could have upstairs. So kids would be waiting out here in the hall for a chance to go up and get in on the dance and so forth. And it was very popular. And as far as the church is concerned, yeah, then and now we made space available for other groups. Just Ed Cahill was very interested in photography, and he was a member of the Nashua Camera Club, and they met and used our kitchen as their darkroom at their monthly meetings.
Interesting. So tell us a couple of your favorite stories. You alluded to kicking Philip Stevens. What's that story?
Well, this was obviously when I was about 5 years old. For some reason, my father brought me to church, but my parents did not go to church. He said he would pick me up afterwards. So church is over, and I'm out front and waiting for my father, and the crowd is diminishing. Phil Stevens came up to me and said, "Bobby, how are you getting home?" And I said, "My father is coming after me." "Oh, all right." More time passes, father hasn't showed up, there's nobody around. Phil takes me by the arm and says, "Bobby, let me give you a ride home." Well, of course, I'd been told by my mother, you never ride with a stranger. And it didn't make any difference that I'd known who this man was for my entire life, and that he was pillar of the church, leading citizen, and so forth. So he started leading me over to his car, and I kicked him in the shins and said, "No!" At which point my father drove up, and all Phil said was, "George, you have a very determined young man there." And of course then Otto Lighting made a parish call, again roughly the same age. This one afternoon came down to our house, and he was sitting on the sofa next to me, and he patted me on the head and said, "How's Bobby today?" I turned and looked to him and said, "Stop that, you damn fool." Well, of course, my mother promptly evaporated. And I thought that had been long since forgotten, but somewhere in the late 1950s, when Lighting had retired and was back in Nashua and so forth, we were talking one day, and he said, "Bob, do you remember the time you called me a damn fool?"
He hadn't forgotten.
He hadn't forgotten, no.
So one other thing I wanted to touch on, you had mentioned this in a previous conversation that I thought was fascinating. When the Unitarians and Universalists here merged in the late 50s,
Yeah.
the question of whether to call ourselves a church or a society,
Yeah.
which I guess both the Unitarians and Universalists previously had been societies.
Right, and we had, that meeting was in the auditorium up here, and there was sentiment on both sides. I personally voted to remain a society, but the majority said we're going to be a church, and so we became and are a church.
And what's the reason that we had previously been a society?
Well, I think there's probably several reasons, but one was that at the time the Unitarian churches got started, the established church, particularly in Massachusetts, was the Congregational Trinitarian Puritan Church, and anybody else had trouble getting themselves called a church. Well, I think it's interesting that if you go down to Boston or the neighborhood of Boston, all of the old Congregational Puritan churches that went Unitarian still call themselves churches, but ones like this church that started independently of any established church chose to call themselves societies, and there may have been something in law that made that a requirement. So we were a society, and of course there are many, many Unitarian Universalist organizations today call themselves churches, societies, fellowships,
Right.
and any name works for me, although I supported society.
Well, why don't we move into the sanctuary and talk a
Okay.
little bit about the architecture and the development there?
Okay, very good.